Welcome to Uncomfortable Growth Uncut, where we celebrate those who defy fear, embrace growth, and live without regret. In this episode, we peel back the layers to reveal the person behind the profile with Dan Gregory. Dan shares his life-changing journey of overcoming a severe health crisis that almost cost him his life, redefining his identity and emerging 65 kilograms lighter. His story isn't just about shedding physical weight, it's about the weight of identity, habits, and deeply ingrained beliefs. Don't miss this witty and humorous episode from a master of behavioral science who has walked the hard path of transformation himself. So welcome, Dan, to Uncomfortable Growth Uncut. I'm here talking to the incomparable Dan Gregory, who, let me get this right, is the co-founder of the Behavior Report, but is so much more, a man of much experience, a man of much wisdom and insight, and a really funny guy. So welcome, Dan. It's great to have you on Uncomfortable Growth Uncut.
Oh, thanks, Rowena. That was a great introduction. It can only go downhill from here.
That's the plan.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm in your hands.
Okay, awesome. So, from the amount of time that we've spent together, and I should add that I did a program of Dan and Kieran's a few years ago around personal branding. I just love the stories that you told throughout that program, and just in terms of our general interactions. And so I'm going to let you choose your juiciest uncomfortable growth story to kick off, because I know that you will have so many to choose from.
Oh, look, yeah, absolutely. I think all growth is uncomfortable. Which is why I love the title of the podcast too. So well done on that. But I think what's been interesting for me recently is sort of the health challenge that I've had. So I'm going to start with that. And I'm sure we'll end up somewhere different, but that's fine. So I have been significantly overweight for most of my life. Someone who, there's a great line, Sir Ken Robinson in his TED talk, he talks about professors as being people who see their bodies as being a way of getting their heads to meetings. And I think I was very much of that ilk. I valued intellectual health significantly more than physical health. And that debt came due a few years ago. I got really sick. Having been diabetic for a large portion of my adult life, since I was about 37, 38. It was a family thing. It was, I fit the family profile. My name was always on that bullet. Yeah. But yeah, so I got really sick in 2020 or 2021 during COVID and almost died. And so I kind of went, okay, I've reached threshold. I've now lived on as much health credit as I had available. It's time to start paying back the debt. And so that was a real challenge for me. So fast forward to today. So I'm probably, since this time last year, or a little bit later than this time last year, I'm 65 kilograms lighter.
That's a big amount lighter.
Yeah, that's like a whole human being lighter. Yeah. I'm no longer considered diabetic. My diabetes is in remission. I no longer have blood pressure issues. I'm no longer on any medication.
So your diabetes is in remission.
Yeah, so it's everything's. So yeah, my last time I had my blood pathology done, all of my readings were perfect. My blood pressure's 120/78. It's all in the perfect range. In fact, the doctor who took my blood pressure said, oh, when we go to medical school or university, they tell us this is what blood pressure reading should be, but you'll never see it. He said, you're the first person I've ever seen with a perfect reading. Or certainly, someone who he hasn't seen in a long time. So yeah, so that was sort of I think that's a good uncomfortable growth story, because it required a non-linear path as well. Because I think the other thing, and you may have seen me posting about it, was in some ways the mechanical part of losing the weight was simple, if not easy. However, the identity challenge has been a bigger thing.
Yeah. And what I love about, sorry to interrupt you, Dan, but
No.
what I love about what you're talking about too is you're someone who is a leading expert in behavioral science,
Oh,
right?
shut up. I know.
But I think this is real, because often what we know, at least in our heads, it's different when you go to put it into practice. There can still be a very big chasm between the two. And there's so many things about your story I'm so keen to unpack. So can we start, right? Because there's so much to unpack here. Can we start with you being diagnosed as a diabetic? I think you said around mid-30s.
Yeah.
Because, you kind of referenced that there was a genetic predisposition in your family, or there was something that made you more likely. So tell me about what you were going through or thinking about right at the start, when I guess you got a serious health diagnosis and
Yeah.
something that you knew you would have to manage.
It's funny. I didn't even think of it as a serious health diagnosis at the time, because it was a familial thing. I know that sounds weird. I didn't, and because it was physical health, I just didn't take it seriously. As long as it didn't impair my capacity to think, I was sort of, oh, whatever. So I can't, I was, so my business partner, Kieran Flanagan, who but just to give some reference for people who are listening who don't know us. So Kieran and I have been in business together for over 30 years. So we're very close. We were doing a shoot. We were both still working in advertising back then. We were doing a shoot on the Gold Coast, funnily enough, with Mo McRae, who you probably know as well.
Yeah.
So Mo was directing a commercial for us, and Kieran and her husband Gary were up on the Gold Coast. They'd gone up. I think they were going to visit family or something, and we're on a shoot. And so I came down in the morning for the shoot, and I said to Kieran, I can't feel either of my hands. I woke up and my hands were asleep, and they're not waking up. I'm just going to go up to the pharmacy and buy a blood glucose testing machine, because I reckon this is diabetes, right? And so, I'd known, because Mum was diabetic from about the same age. Her father had been diabetic. As far as we know, diabetes could go back further, but the records of what actually killed people, you don't know
For
really.
generations, yeah.
Yeah, it could have been. So I went and I bought the BGL tester, and so based on Australian standards, anything above 7 is considered pre-diabetic. Anything above 10 is definitely diabetic. I was 28.5. So I was, so I'm like, well, this is diabetes. And so when I got back to Sydney, I went to see the doctor, and she said, oh, we'll test to see if you're diabetic. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure we are, but let's do the test. So we did the test anyway. And that was a really frustrating journey. So again, what am I now? 54. So this is a while ago. And the general thinking on diabetes has really shifted a lot, in terms of, like, they used to recommend a diet that was high carbohydrate and low fat. and now they recommend exactly the opposite for diabetes. So I was like, we talked about the fact that, I'm meant to be this behavioral expert, and I struggled, right? What's interesting is I am super disciplined with if someone gives me, here are the instructions, just do this. Like, I'm not one of those people who has to, like, I don't mind breaking the rules, but if there's a result I can see, I'm good at digging in.
Compliance.
So what was interesting was I just leaned in. I did everything I was supposed to do, and my diabetes got worse and my weight got worse. And I'm like, well, this is crazy. And meanwhile, I was dealing with an endocrinologist who I didn't particularly like. I mean, he was just going through a drug catalog and going, well, let's try this one. Let's try that one. Let's try that. And I'm like, dude, I could Google this.
I could do this. Yeah.
Not particularly helpful. Anyway, so it just got progressively worse, and I just kind of accepted, okay, well, this is just going to get worse, and then eventually it will kill me, right? And then I found this really good GP who was actually who wasn't like other GPs. Like, most GPs, now this is a bit unfair, but you meet a GP and you think, yeah, well, you weren't top of the class, were you? Right? Because every industry has a bottom of the class, right? You think if you were really good, you'd been a specialist, but this guy was really good. And I really respected him. He was terrific. And we tried a few different things. And he got me onto a drug that was actually quite new at the time. And it seemed to make a difference. However, because it was quite new, it hadn't been in market testing for a long period of time. Like, it had done all of its, FDA
requirements,
the States and requirements here in Australia, and all of those things were fine. And what later transpired is it's a great drug until it goes wrong, and then it goes catastrophically wrong.
Right. Okay.
Which is actually what happened to me. And at the time it went wrong, it was during COVID, so you couldn't get in to see a doctor, so you had to do teleconsults. And my doctor was away on holidays, so I spoke to a doctor I didn't know, and their feeling was, oh, it could be something viral, it could be COVID. We're not 100% sure, but we'll give you some antibiotics, which isn't really for viruses anyway. So it was a strange decision, but I think it was just a catch-all. We're not 100% sure what's wrong. 5 days later, I hadn't slept, I hadn't eaten. I was completely hallucinating.
Oh my God.
I had no grip on
reality.
reality.
On your own because of COVID? Like, were you just
No,
on, or were you
I wasn't. And in fact, my wife called the doctor and said, well, this isn't right, and spoke to a different doctor, because they were locums coming in and doing while my doctor was away. And this doctor said, call the ambulance, get him to the hospital. So I get to the hospital, and basically the admitting doctor at the emergency room looked at the meds I was on, recognized what it was. It was diabetic ketoacidosis, which basically means my body is just removing ketones at an uncontrollable rate. And basically my potassium was through the floor. Like, it was. It's funny. I was in the ICU for, I don't know, a week or 10 days. I'm not even sure, because I wasn't
conscious. Yeah.
Well, I was conscious, but I wasn't conscious of what was happening. And basically, if you know anything about neuroscience, you know that the way signals are sent down the axiom of a neuron, it's a potassium and sodium exchange across the axiom, and it passes along the line, right? So if you've got no sodium, your brain's not really firing. And I actually had a moment where a nurse walked into so I ended up having, like, I had 4 drips, 2 going into each arm, and a cannula going into another part of the arm. And they were just pumping me full of potassium and other things. But my potassium was so low. One of the ICU nurses walked in, looked at my potassium readings and visibly gasped. So that wasn't a good sign.
No.
And the admitting doctor said, look, when you came in, you were about 24 hours away from complete organ failure and death, basically.
My goodness.
And so, so that was kind of a wake-up call. And that was one of the things that triggered Kieran and I to do the program that we did with you, Rowena, was, coming out of the hospital, I said to Kieran, well, I'm kind of on bonus time now. This is like an extra round that,
may not have happened.
Yeah, 20 years ago, I would have been dead, and so we went, well, let's experiment with, what we want to spend our time doing and so that led to sort of a couple of years of experimentation for us, just figuring out what we wanted to do. And it's funny, after that, I lost weight, like a significant amount of weight, and then found a way to put it all back on again in the year or year and a half that followed. And then I've dropped the 65 kilos in the past year. And, one of the things that, we were talking about was the mechanics of losing weight, while not easy, is simple, or is simple now for me. But the identity piece is really, it's funny. Kieran and I do a lot of work talking about, people's default filters and frames, which is sort of based on having a psychological set point.
Yeah.
Right. But physiologically, we have a set point as well. So I was 145 kilos. I'm now about 80 kilos. But identity-wise, my brain keeps wanting me to go back to 145 kilos, even though I know it, I logically know it's a bad thing. But there's a psychological and physiological desire. And look, it's a survival thing as well. If you lose an entire human being's worth of weight, well, your body evolutionarily says, well, that's not a good thing. Clearly we're in a famine or something, and I need to store fat.
We need to lock down for hard times.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. So I've actually found the identity piece more challenging. And given I work in, the field of identity, it's actually been a really good test case for me to think about. How do I
new learning curve?
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. I've never struggled with behavioral discipline around things that are work related, but I've had to learn to care about the physical.
So there's I was actually having a conversation this morning with someone, and the thing that you're articulating also came up for me, which I think is just fascinating, right? When something, a new thought occurs, often the universe reinforces it, or maybe you notice it, whatever approach you want to believe in. But it was this idea around we overdevelop in some areas and underdevelop in others.
Oh, for sure.
And I was talking about it this morning in the context of thinking and doing, right?
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying is you talking about it in the context of thinking or your work, so mental capacity versus physical capacity. And your mental capacity, which I can attest to, is extremely developed and strong. But it has taken you a very different, I guess, lifespan and also different triggers to basically then come to terms with your physical strength or your physical capacity, which I think is really interesting, because even though we know our minds and bodies are interwoven,
yes,
often develop them in very separate ways and on very different timeframes.
Oh yeah, and I think education encourages that as well.
Yeah.
You know PE is an hour on Thursday or whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
And it's seen as a very different part of development. I mean, it's interesting. I was watching a podcast interview with Jimmy Carr,
Uh-huh.
a comedian out of the UK, who, funnily enough, I did stand up with many years ago. Um, but Jimmy was talking about he thinks comedy should be taught in schools because it's a capacity to have an abstraction around observation and perspective. And Kieran and I have often talked about the fact that a basic education in behavioral science will be useful in school because we're all people,
Yes.
but no one tells us how to run this machine. No one tells us how to interact. No one tells us how relationships are supposed to work.
Mhm.
What are the rules of engagement for friendship or for personal relationships? None of that stuff really gets like we get sex education, we don't get relationship education, which is odd.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we need, I don't know.
No,
Some
I totally agree with you, particularly around the reality that we're whole people, right? With all these
Yeah.
different aspects, all these different dimensions. And you can broadly say there's, yourself, there's relationships, there's work, and maybe there's contribution.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's all these dimensions, but you're right, our education focuses
Yeah.
dominantly on, mental, but also then work or career. And obviously there's
Yeah.
pragmatism around that, but that doesn't help us to be the best people at work
It's
either.
not even that pragmatic though, Rowena, I don't think.
Uh-huh.
It's like I can integrate the area under a catenary, but unless I'm an engineer, that's not particularly useful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or an architect, perhaps.
Yeah.
However, and again, I'm not complaining that people don't get taught how to be leaders. It keeps Kieran and I and you in business, right? But I think it's interesting to me that we don't get taught how to do that. I mean, Kieran and I like to say we're in the business of helping smart people to be people smart
Mm.
because a lot of really technically brilliant people are really terrible leaders,
Mm.
or they get, we get elevated to our level of incompetence, right? It's an old cliche, but it's true.
Mhm.
And I think it's really the thing that I needed to learn. Like I was very academic. I was very quiet. I actually had a client once asked Kieran if I was autistic after a meeting because I would sit in silence and I've got not, a reasonably eidetic memory. And then I'd write a summary of the meeting that would be verbatim. People were like,
Mm.
geez, who brought Rain Man to the meeting, right? And so even for me, I think the conversation you had this morning around, we overdevelop. And that's one of the things that Kieran and I talk about in, a lot of our work is around personality psychology. And we were talking just before we started this about, some of the things, if you have a look at Myers-Briggs or DISC or, any of the commercial models, they talk in a very binary way. You're introverted or extroverted,
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
the scientific model, the ocean model, if you've ever studied personality psychology at university, that's the model they'll teach you.
Mhm.
And they say, well, no, it's not binary. There's an extroversion spectrum that you sit on somewhere.
Mm.
And I think the interesting additional distinction for Kieran and I is, yeah, you sit there as a default, but it's not fixed. So
Mm.
it's a set point, it's not fixed. And in fact, your evolution is through growing beyond your fixed point. But again, if you think about, whatever one of those models of psychology that you want to consider.
Mhm.
So you've kind of got those who filter the world through imagination, those who filter through feeling, those who filter through thinking, those who filter through doing.
Mhm.
Now that's a very unfair summary of a very broad category of psychology, but let's play with that. What we tend to find is Kieran and I talk about default filters and frames, and a default filter is how you tend to make meaning. It's not who you are, it's how you tend to make meaning. And a default frame is how you tend to solve problems. Again, not who you are, it's how you tend to. It's tendency. And what happens is because we over-index in one, possibly two of those, but there's usually something primary and potentially something secondary. What we tend to do is we tend to make meaning in a particular way. We tend to communicate in a particular way. We tend to choose a particular palette of words. And one of the things, so Kieran and I were running a leadership retreat on Thursday and Friday, and one of the things we were doing was we were saying actually the way people talk is very much like Twitter. We tend to use keywords that are almost like hashtags that reveal the filter or frame that we're using. And if you can tune your ear in like a musical instrument, you can actually hear, oh, that's the filter that they're using at the moment.
Yeah.
And if I can learn to speak back to them into that filter, it's not about manipulating them, but it's about speaking to them in their language. And the metaphor Kieran and I often use is most of us are like tourists that are yelling at the locals more loudly in English instead of speaking to them in their language, right?
Yeah, great.
And wondering why, misunderstanding is occurring. Well, it's naturally occurring because even though we're both speaking English, we're actually speaking a different language.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of over-indexing either in a particular filter or frame or a particular values hierarchy, which is where we started. I had a values hierarchy that started at the head and the body was at the physical's at the very bottom. Physical and emotional is probably both at the bottom for me. But I think it's interesting that we do tend to filter the world that way. And actually our growth, coming back to the point of the whole podcast, is often through our opposites and our adjacents. And one of the challenges I have with positive psychology, even though I love Seligman's work and the work of Pinker and all the other people who've contributed to that suite of psychology, one of the problems I have is, while I agree with playing to your strengths, playing to your strengths and ignoring your weaknesses is actually ignoring part of who you are. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I so agree with that, because it's often through what we're not good at or what we don't succeed in or when things go wrong, right? The curveballs, all those things that happen. I find that's where we learn the most.
Well, yeah, it's where we learn, but it's also what makes us unique. Like typically our strengths are generic. But our weaknesses are usually interesting, right? The foibles we have, and oftentimes, and again, we've both done a lot of work with brand and marketing, and oftentimes I'll say, no, the opportunity's in the weakness.
Yeah.
Not the strength. So, look, there's a few problems with strengths. Firstly, they're usually category generic.
Yep.
Secondly, they're contextual. Like, so category generic. If you're in a room full of carpenters, being good with a hammer's pretty much it's table stakes, right? It's contextual. You might be good with a hammer, but if you've got to change a light bulb, probably not that useful. Almost all of our available improvement is actually in our weakness. You might be a 9 out of 10 with a hammer, but a 2 out of 10 with finances and invoicing, and actually that's where your attention should go. And it tends to amplify our cognitive biases. When all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yep.
And the other thing is, and this is a more recent model, people tend to say, oh, what we should do is just play to our strengths and outsource our weaknesses.
I've heard that a lot. I've heard that a lot. Yep.
It's really, really common. But in a solo pursuit, you can't. Like you're never going to hear, and representing Australia in the 50 meters freestyle, Dan Gregory, but he's really terrible at diving. So the dive is going to be performed by his Michelle, his EA from the Philippines, right? You can't. There's some stuff you just have to lift. And again, coming back to personal growth stories, it's why I really did stand-up comedy. As I said, Kieran literally had a client, a really nice person. And this is in the late 1990s. You probably wouldn't ask if someone was autistic today because we live in a different political environment. But the reason I did stand-up comedy was I was a terrible presenter, like really bad. And to be honest, filtering it as a disability is not too far from the mark. It was a professional disability in a lot of ways. And so stand-up comedy was about getting bulletproof, about being comfortable in front of an audience that could challenge me.
Yeah.
Um, and if you said to someone I went to school with, oh, Dan was a stand-up comedian and now works as a professional speaker all around the world in front of audiences of thousands of people,
Yeah.
they would assume you were talking about someone else. So in other words, my strength, which was my capacity to think strategically and creatively,
Uh-huh.
didn't diminish, but my weakness became an asset.
Yes. Yes. And you
And
managed to bring them together, because I think
yeah,
that's also a really important piece, which is, if you think about a strength, then you can think of the opposite as the weakness almost. But there are actually multiple dimensions. So while you
of
had
course.
a strength in, strategy, creativity, mental acuity, let's just call it,
Mm, mm,
um, you knew you had a weakness, or you didn't feel comfortable standing up or speaking or connecting with other people in real time.
yeah.
But you not only managed to address that, you managed to bring them together to create something even better, something new. So, stand up is a creative form as well, right? So you could have just become someone who talks to people in meetings throughout
Mm.
the meeting, but instead you actually created something, not just the opposite, but something new.
Yeah. Look, it was training at altitude as
Mm,
well. Like,
mm.
no, like no one in a corporate audience is going to call out from the back of the room, well, I shagged your mum. If I've got something I can return if they do. But I think for me it was really training at altitude. And one of the interesting things you just said, Rowena, is your strengths and weaknesses can often be opposites. But in fact, the other thing that's interesting about that is again, because it's contextual, is we often forget, how can our weakness actually become a vulnerability? Or how can our weakness actually become an opportunity? And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because people will often say, like when we do a lot of, in particularly more in the public space, but a lot of personal development as part of the professional development. And it's always hand in hand, right? You've actually got to work with the person if you want to work with the professional.
Yeah.
However, if someone might say to us, oh, I'm a terrible procrastinator.
Mm,
And often the first place will go, okay, and how does that serve you?
mm.
What's that given you? What's the reward? And the truth is, being a procrastinator can be a really good thing. It stops you doing stupid things. It stops you rushing in.
Yeah.
And yet we have this very polarized view of strengths and weaknesses. Strengths are good, weaknesses are bad. And it's like, well, it depends.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really useful question for people to ask themselves when it comes to personal growth is, actually, a lot of the things you've developed are really, really useful, even though they may not be particularly useful in the application you've applied them to.
Mm.
And so it's not just about the strength and weakness conversation, it's about the application as well.
I love that too, because you've taken my brain down a different route with that. Because when we talk about transferable skills, often we
Mm.
take the execution. But actually, what I hear you also saying is sometimes there's a lot of skill behind the current application, which could actually be taken into a new context with even higher value.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Which is really about, like, the theme I'm getting for you in so many ways is what's behind, what sits behind
Mm.
the obvious, right? So whether it's
Actually, that's perfect. That's exactly, but that's what psychology is. That's what
yeah,
stand-up comedy is. That's the
yeah,
that's the universal umbrella, I think, that you've identified.
yeah, because it's what sits behind that. And don't throw out the binary piece which says good, bad, or white, black, or
Mm.
there's shades of gray. There's a lot of nuance and depth. And I think when we also then get into creating, 1 + 1 = 3, that 3 can be so
Yes.
many incredible things, but it still sits on the spectrum of gray as well. And I know we're talking very conceptually now, but
Mm.
I get really excited with these conversations because from my personal beliefs and perspective, you need the light and dark to
Yes.
explore and get the real value out of the gray. And the shades of gray has unlimited value behind it, but you can't just harness it or mine it with one tool, right? You need
Yeah, very true.
multiple ways to be able to find the specks of gold, which kind of brings me also to what you were talking about with your identity.
Mm.
So your thinking brain was overdeveloped. Your body got to a point where it said, you can't ignore me. We may not continue together. Um, and then you talked about how you were able to execute what you needed to do, but how the part behind that, the Dan, the identity that was made up of a lot more than just physical, was somehow lagging or had more work to do. So I'd love to hear about, yeah, kind of
Lag.
your, yeah, yeah, kind of
Yeah.
how you're reconciling that, because I'm assuming too that this is ongoing for you. Like this is an ongoing story
Oh,
for you.
for sure. For sure. I mean, it's funny. I'm wearing a black shirt today. I've actually started wearing color, and even just really leaning into being more open-minded, I think,
Hmm.
as a result of this, and just I and perhaps it's something to do with age and stage. I do think that life is quite seasonal,
Hmm.
and in fact, we talk about midlife crisis, but is it really a crisis if every single human being is going through it? Maybe it's just part of the seasonal reinvention. Maybe just
Hmm. I love that.
every 50 or so years we have to reinvent, or we're asked to reinvent, and whether we do or not kind of determines what's next. And
Hmm.
so I think that's a really interesting part of it, and deciding, coming back to this idea of evolving through your opposites and your adjacents,
Hmm.
and the fact that, if I think about the default filter and frame, which is very much about thinking for me, and being open to the physical, being open to feeling, being open to imagining, right, and possibility, um, is actually part of the growth. And again, a lot of the work that Kieran and I do is with teams and leaders, and helping them be more collaborative. And how do you create a complete team? How do you hire so that you have people with cognitive diversity, not just demographic diversity, which actually doesn't move the dial in terms of performance at all. It's just a corporate social responsibility box to tick. But cognitive diversity really changes our ability to solve problems and be innovative and respond after challenge.
Hmm.
However, the opportunity is not just to build a team that way. The opportunity is for you as an individual to grow through those disowned parts of yourself, which
Hmm.
sounds a very,
I love that. No, I love that articulation, the disowned parts of yourself.
yeah, I think it is, it's, of course, I'm a feeling human being. Of course, I'm a creative human being. Of course, I'm a physical human being. I've just ignored that stuff,
Hmm.
or rather than not ignored, not cared for, right, or not prioritized.
Hmm.
And I think that's an interesting journey, and we all do that. And again, Kieran and I are quite opposite on the spectrum. Kieran is very uh, emotional, not emotional, emotionally intelligent, and imaginative, whereas I'd probably err towards thoughtful and demonstrative. You know, Kieran hates conflict. I love conflict. You know, if voices are raised and people are arguing, I'm in heaven. Kieran is really uncomfortable. So I think, but again, so there's certain things that, or certain functions, like even within the business, that we'll do or we'll think about applying just because one person's stronger than the other. However, that doesn't mean that I get to neglect nurturing a team member, or that Kieran gets to avoid having a challenging conversation with someone, right? And again, you'd end up with a limited experience of life if you only did the things that you were immediately good at. And I think it's funny. I was doing I was being interviewed for another podcast this morning before you, which was weird. But I was talking about the difference between learning a skill versus learning a discipline. And so learning a skill is, you know, I'll teach you how to fold a fitted bed sheet, and then you know how to fold a fitted bed sheet, right? So it's a skill. Whereas a discipline is more like learning a musical instrument. Like I can teach you to play some notes, but you're going to be pretty crappy for a couple of years. Right. And it's one of the, so I grew up in a very musical family. Mum was a child prodigy, right? Won the national step when she was like 12 or something. And one of the things I liked about learning musical instruments, because everyone in my family plays multiple instruments, was you couldn't cheat. Like you had to put in the time, you had to put in the consistency. It was a discipline that was learned. And there was a tipping point where all of a sudden unconscious competence emerged, and all of a sudden your hands were going to the right notes without thought. And I think that there's I think that's a useful distinction, because I think we're quite good at teaching people skills, but forgetting to allow them a discipline. And oftentimes emotional intelligence is a discipline, not a skill, or it's not, or creativity. You know, we all, you know, Kieran and I talk about this a lot. It's a discipline, not a skill. And so too is anything physical. Sorry, Rowena, go.
No, I was just going to say, I really like what you're saying behind skill versus discipline, because I also think too that we see things as a weakness because it doesn't feel that we know how to do it well. So
sure,
you know, like for example, before you became a stand-up comedian, you really didn't know how to be a stand-up comedian. And the point you're making on discipline is you have to put in the work to be able to learn, which goes back to all the theory behind growth mindset, right? Like you have to put in effort to progress. But what I think is also really interesting, and I'm thinking of your personal story here, is it's that discipline and that progression where you gain that unconscious competence that I think helps our identity to catch up, which is, you know, because then it's kind of built in. It's automatic, or it's unconscious. It's something that we've done enough that we can just pick up an instrument and play.
Well, it's also about belief.
Yeah.
You know, what you've just picked up on is the belief that you can.
Yes.
Because I think
you have the belief that you can, almost because you have, because of the discipline.
Through doing. Yeah. And I think we've all got this exquisite BS detector at the back of our heads that calls us out whenever we behave in an incongruous way, or a way that we or we aspire to something that doesn't seem believable. It's funny, I was writing about this morning when I woke up. You know, the reticular activating system. You know, you've probably seen Tony Robbins do his thing, right? Close your eyes and remember everything red, right? Now point to something blue, right? And of course, because your attention's been tuned on everything red, you can't see the blue thing, right? Or you can't remember the blue thing. And I think that we do that in that's a really overt way of doing it, but I think we do that in really, really subtle ways as well. I think if we have an unconscious belief that we can't do something, we gather evidence for it. And in fact, so one of the things we were doing on Thursday and Friday with this leadership team was teaching them to speak across the different filters, right? And one of the problems with so again, coming back to the brand and marketing history, if you think about the AIDA model, attention, interest, desire, action, right? Is it's fundamentally wrong because desire precedes interest. You go, oh, that's a great looking car. I wonder if they're any good. And then you find reasons that they're good, right? Oh, she's beautiful. I wonder if she's smart, and then you invest time, right? But you have a desire.
Yeah.
So the heart leads the head, right? But we don't think that way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it's useful to understand when we get that sequence wrong as well. But coming back to the identity piece, I think so. I do a lot of work with identity based personally, but also cultural identity, because that's essentially identity is what drives all of our behavior. We don't behave a particular way because it's rational. We don't even behave a particular way because it's emotionally satisfying. We behave a particular way because it's congruent with our identity. That's what an Australian would do. That's what an American would do. That's what a Christian would do. That's what a Muslim would do. That's what a member of a particular tribe would do. We've got these very identity-based behaviors, and they become autonomous and they become self-correcting. It's why culture is so valuable, right? However, it's really hard to shift. Identity is hard. And one of the tools I use is all about transitional identity, which is, it's not so much about, gender pronouns. It's about how do you go from one identity to another without hitting cognitive dissonance, right? So even though I use this in a cultural framework, often I'll use a personal one. So I talk about, I'm fat, but I want to be fit. Now, if I used 1980s self-help, which says the unconscious mind can't tell the difference between whether you're lying or telling the truth. Yeah, it can. And because the conscious brain throws up a lot of really good arguments, right?
Yeah.
So they would say, okay, what you need to do is say affirmations. Look in front of the mirror and in a positive voice and present tense, say, I'm thin, I'm fit, I'm healthy, I'm amazing, right? And the problem is your brain in the back of your head going, what are you talking about? You're wearing size 42 pants, Dan, what the hell?
Yeah.
And so all of this stuff's going on in the back of your head, and you're actually, but by trying to lie to yourself, you're actually prompting your brain to question it.
Yeah.
However, if you're able to create a transitional identity, which is an identity that's congruent to both, and then build some behavioral anchors under it,
Yeah.
you're able to go from one identity to the other, but your brain doesn't experience the friction of dissonance.
Yeah.
Because both are believable. And I think that's, and again, that's one of the interesting, it's funny, I've always taught this at an academic level. It's a tool I've used for a very long period of time. However, having to apply it to myself in a personal way has been actually really interesting, and just figuring out, it's one of the reasons why you can't tell, I'm wearing beige chinos and white sneakers, which, very different to all of my everything black uniform that you will remember me from. But, and I've got blue shirts and red shirts and, but again, part of that is behavioral anchoring outside of the old identity, right? So it's, one of the things we know from behavioral economics is in the long run, context beats character.
Uh-huh.
Now, we don't like to think that way. We like to think, well, I'm a self-made man and I'm a success because of my self-discipline and bloody, bloody, blah. Well, you also probably grew up in a first world country, had mandatory education.
Yeah.
You exist in a country that has a capitalist economy with an infrastructure system that allows for, rule of law for logistics systems. And
Yeah.
I didn't invent the internet,
Yeah.
right? So, so what we know is that for long-term success, Kahneman and Tversky and Richard Thaler and people like Dan O'Reilly talk about is, and Thaler, when he talked about the nudge, all a nudge is environmental design that has a bias towards a particular kind of behavior. That's all it is, right?
Yeah.
And the most common example we use is putting your alarm clock on the other side of the bedroom when you have to be up early in the morning,
So you
right?
get up and
Yeah, so you have to physically get out of bed
actually
to turn
press
it off, right?
stop. Yeah.
And that's all I'm really talking. That's all a behavioral anchor is what are those things that influence the behavior until the behavior becomes entrenched as part of an identity.
Yeah. And I think the other part that you're highlighting too is nothing nothing sets the brain more than doing, but the so getting out of bed, right? So if you say here's the context that helps to shape the behavior, and you
Mhm.
put your alarm clock across the room, so you literally have to get out of bed, and you do that for a week, and suddenly you feel like, oh, it's not so hard to get out of bed.
Yeah.
So you're also reprogramming yourself by doing, and doing is such a big part of that. My daughter a few years ago had a, an unusual condition called chronic regional pain syndrome,
Mm.
where basically it's a glitch that happens. They're not sure why, but where you've hurt something, in her case, her knees, um,
Right.
the sensory signals back to the nervous system were basically saying her knee was still saying that it was as if she just dislocated it, right? So it was a dancing injury. She'd hurt
Oh,
her.
this is posted actually healing.
Yeah, yeah. So
Okay.
she was in constant pain as if she'd just dislocated her knee, even though physically it had
Right.
healed. And it was interesting because, we had to go and see pain specialists because we're like, well, what's going on? And when we finally found the right specialist, again, they don't know why it happens, but they know it does sometimes happen,
Mm.
quite rarely, but it does. But they know how to fix it, which is you basically have to learn how to use your limb through the pain. It's the same thing that happens when someone maybe loses a limb in an accident. So you know how they
Oh,
talk
phantom limb pain. Yeah.
it's basically the same thing that's happening in the system,
Mm.
because the brain believes the limb is still there and hurt
Yeah.
even though it's not there. Or in her case, the brain believes that she's just dislocated her knee, even though physically it's healed.
Okay.
And so it's a very complex piece, but I remember, as we all went through that journey, just again coming from a different angle, but learning that doing resets your belief and your brain
Mm.
more than anything else. And the reason why I'm raising this is because it links in for me with what you were saying about music practice and discipline.
Mm.
Like you do it. You create environments that help you to change behavior, and doing it
Yeah.
becomes unconscious or automatic or easier depending on where you are in the journey. And all of the work around Atomic Habits by James Clear, and so much of psychology is around how do you
Yeah.
reset by doing. But if it's too big a gap, too big a jump, then we resist. Our brain
Yeah.
resists. Our brain says, no, 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 you're not going from being the person who, to use a metaphor, you're not going to be the person who sits in an armchair and then runs a marathon. Like you have to be
No.
to
Yeah.
reset the conditions, get out of the chair, start to go for a walk, start to go for a run, start to train, eventually build up to it. And that progression, I think, is a piece which is so important, and it gets glossed over often because we're always looking for the outcome, or like, what does the endpoint look like? But actually, the endpoint only happens when you can create the little steps. So what you were, talking about with, can't remember the exact word you used, the transition.
Yes.
Yeah. To me is a similar thing. It's like, if you go from here to here, it's too big a gap. But if you go from here to here, where it can be true for both your brain and your body, then you can move to that first step, and then you can take the second and the third and the fourth.
Yeah,
And
it's a little bit
that
like when you change someone's uniform, it changes their behavior. Now, the clothing they wear shouldn't make any difference, but it absolutely does because it's an identity piece, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny. I was listening to you speaking then, and I could feel myself bristling.
Uh-huh.
And the reason I was bristling is because again, it's coming back to my bias, which is no, Rowena, you don't learn by doing, you learn by thinking, right? And ignoring the physical, right? Which is, and it was it was interesting. Even though I was conceptually agreeing with you, I could feel myself bristling, and I'm like, why am I thinking that? And it's because of the bias I have. Like, you've probably heard, people talk about different learning styles, and there's some science in it, but it's probably overstated. Some people are more auditory, some people are more visual, some people are more kinesthetic, right? And I always look down my nose at the kinesthetic learners, the people who learn by doing, even though I studied behavioral economics and I know the theory. And I used to do this line on stage, particularly when I was in Queensland, because I'd often get invited to give a speech during State of Origin. And I'd make a joke about Queenslanders being good at sport, but that's why we invented sport, to keep the slow kids busy while the rest of us were indoors learning, right? So, but you can hear my bias and my judgment around it, right? And it's funny, right? But it's interesting that we're having this conversation, and
you can still feel your frames. You can still feel
absolutely, and I'm agreeing with you at a conscious level, but there's still this trigger in my head that's like, no, Rowena, you learn just by listening. Like, it's funny, this workshop, 2-day workshop, Kieran and I ran, right? And Kieran's great at challenging me to shift the way I work. And to be honest, if I designed this workshop on my own, it would have been a 16-hour lecture, and there would have been a test at the end, right? And Kieran's like, dude, you can't do that to people. You've got to have some interaction. There's got to be some gamification, some exercises, some feedback, I'm like, oh, really? But how am I going to get through all the information I have in my head? She's like, you're not, right? Like, Kieran's great. Like, she's, apart from me, a really good business partner, she's a really good coach. Like, she used to say to me, because I used to get really frustrated that people weren't using what I was giving them. And she'd say, Dan, you think everyone should be as smart as you on your special subject after listening to you for an hour. That's a really unrealistic expectation. They just need to be smarter than they were before they met you. And it was such a freeing reframe for me. But yeah, it's interesting. But again, it comes back to identity, because I filter myself through cognition, not any kind of physical accomplishment. And I actually find, and there's a cultural overlay as well, having grown up in Australia, where if you're not a sports person, you're nothing. That made me hate the physical even more. Like, I know a lot of people who are intellectually gifted have to leave the country to build a career. And certainly I did for a long time, right? And so there's this, it's not just we over-index as individuals, but we over-index culturally as well. And that has knock-on effects as well.
Yeah. And coming back to your point on context.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And like even when, if I'm at a conference and they go, oh, we've got a sports person coming to speak, I'm like, about what? They've never had a job,
You're
right?
so funny.
They do what other people would, they get paid to do what other people pay to do in their spare time, right?
Yeah.
And the model, even military people, I go, the model of leadership is very different to a commercial model of leadership, because
Mhm.
most people don't even like the company they work for. Most people in the military love their country, right? Or they have a sense of patriotic duty. But again, I find that a willingness to uh, explore a view beyond your filter is useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've taken so much out of this conversation. Um, See, I probably don't have your superpower of being to summarize something that was that squiggly, but my biggest outtakes just in this moment
Mm-hmm.
um, have been around recognizing your frames, your default frames,
Yep.
um, helping to embrace different frames. So learning through what isn't your frame and not thinking
Mm.
of it as a just a weakness. It's an opportunity. It's a possibility. And that with your strengths can create something new and even more creative or more impactful. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
And then thinking about also how do you build identity, which is more than just, I think, a single aspect of ourselves. It's more than one dimension. It's not just
Mm.
your
Very much.
body, it's also your heart, it's also your belief, and just all of the science behind that. There's so much science now around it, but how do you figure out how to hack yourself in terms of moving from point A?
Yeah.
You want to get to point D, you're going to have to go B, C. And just always being open to recognizing what makes us human, our defaults, are not always helping us grow to our potential. It's recognizing our defaults, but being willing to lean into developing different aspects of ourselves to be able to unlock new potential, because we're capable of so much, not
Yeah.
just where we start.
Oh, we're capable of being more than we exhibit.
Mm,
Massively,
yeah.
massively. And because again, we shut down aspects of ourselves to fit in.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
actually it's the stuff that doesn't quite fit that's probably where the interest is, I reckon.
Yeah. Well, and also what you were saying too about diversity. It's not just about, you know, culture or physicality, right?
Mm.
It's because you then get very different perspectives or very different applications, very different frames, very different values, beliefs, etc., that challenges us with our default frames.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. And it's the thing we do worst.
yeah.
If it's like, oh, I'll hire a Chinese version of myself, a gay version of myself, a female version of myself. And so you're all having the same conversation, just in different accents,
Exactly,
right?
because what's behind it, not
Mm.
just what's the obvious thing, it's what sits behind it. And as humans, we have so many dimensions of complexity that, I always use the phrase, you need to know yourself to grow yourself. And the more I live into that, the more there are so many layers even within me. It's like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, my life mission is actually inside, um, not just all the things happening in the world, right? So
Yes.
obviously
Mm.
there's an impact between those two, but there is so much nuance and dimension and opportunity potential to unlock when we start to be open. And I love that you use that phrase, I'm being more open. I'm
Mm.
different colors. I'm
I'm trying to be. Look, I said a being might be too much of an overpromise, Rowena. I'm trying. And but again, it's one of those things that, you know, um, one of the famous metaphors is a plane is off course most of the time, and you keep bringing it back to course.
Yeah.
And the Buddhists talk about, your mind wanders during meditation, bring it back to attention, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's, both of those are good metaphors for life, is that, no one, we like to think that it's, I would like to think it was a linear path. Turns out it's not so much.
Mm.
And, you're constantly having to correct.
Yeah.
Um,
It's brilliant. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there because we could literally talk for another another week. No problem. Are there any final thoughts you wanted to leave listeners of Uncomfortable Growth with?
no, do you know what I think the most interesting thing, well, not the most interesting, yeah, possibly the most interesting thing you said was when you identified it's actually what's behind. I think that's, that observation about everything that I've done, that's kind of, I think that is the, um, I think that is the universal fabric that sits behind what I do, is looking for the psychological or the sociological reason behind what shows up.
Mm,
Um, that's what's, and I think the gaps between what we say and what we do are interesting, but also hilarious.
mm-hmm.
So I think that for me is to be interested enough in what you're doing that you look for what's sitting behind. And I think the real key to success is finding what you can be obsessed by.
Yeah, I love that. What you can be obsessed by. That's so good. Thanks so much, Dan. That was brilliant. Thank you.
An absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Pleasure. If you are inspired but thinking, I can't do that, then you are so wrong. Anyone can learn the art of uncomfortable growth with the help of my flagship program, Uncomfortable Growth, Own Your Reinvention. In this, you will learn to navigate your own internal contradictions to finally unlock the courage and commitment to live a deeply meaningful life by design and on your terms. Uncomfortable growth is about the struggle and joy in discovering who you are, what you truly want, and how to make it happen. If this is something you are ready for, then find out more at www.rowenamillward.com. What have you got to lose, or more importantly, gain?